or a workshop today on earthquake-prone buildings update for Wellington. I do just want to acknowledge Councillor Pannett for this work and that you have advocated long and hard to make sure that our city is aware of the challenges we face. And I would just also like to remind councillors that this is a public workshop, and so welcome to everybody in the room that is not from Wellington City Council. Good to have you here, and also to those online, as it will be live streamed. So with that, I will hand over to Liam Hodgetts, who will take us through the kōrero today, but I'll just take us question list, councillors, if you want to ask questions along the way. Over to you. Councillor Pannett has her hand up.
Yeah, through you, Deputy Mayor, that'd be great if we could. So I'll just run through, introduce the team and run through the agenda just quickly. Look, I foreshadowed we'd be bringing this to you in the Audit and Risk meeting last week, and we talked about this issue for quite some time, in particular Councillor Pannett, who's been a very strong advocate of this issue for the city. So also, as we all know, there's been some recent media coverage about this matter. It's been covered by several reporters and several stories. And it was encouraging to hear Minister Pink's comments, actually, about the review that could occur of the program and the system more generally. And that was obviously very welcome, not only by the community of Wellington, but also by officers as well. I've circulated a more detailed slide pack to everyone. We're not going to go through the 40 or so slides that we've provided. It is really just context for councillors to get up to speed and ask some good questions. It's going to be released later to the public and put on the website this afternoon. The purpose of today is really to introduce the team that are working on it, but also introduce how we're going to manage this presentation in parts. And I hope that it's only going to take 25 minutes, so we've got enough time for questions. The first part's the seismic context. Look, as a regulator, we deal with science, and we have to implement science into rules, and we have Sean Ordain there here to talk to you about some of those matters. We also are going to talk about our regulatory function under the Act, so it's important that that's made very clear about what we're required to do. Phil Beck is going to go through that part of the slide. We also have Leston from the property team here. He's going to talk about the council as a building owner of earthquake-prone buildings and provide some advice to you in regards to what that status is. And at the end, I just want to talk with Phil and myself perhaps about the options we have around advocacy. Because if you've had a time to flick through the presentation, there's some thoughts that I'm proposing there about how council might like to position itself in taking this matter to the central government and taking this matter to the nation effectively, because it's something I believe many cities, both large and small in New Zealand, inherit and need to deal with. So I'll finish there, and I'll introduce Phil and Sean to take you through the first couple of parts to the presentation.
Excellent. I'll cover the first part, which is the seismic context we find ourselves in. So we live in one of the most seismically active parts of the world. One of the interesting things about that is as our landscape has changed, so has our understanding of how it has come to be. And as the science has evolved, we have created new seismic models have been created. The latest one has been published by GNS, the National Seismic Hazard Model. This is a significant scientific advance on the last seismic hazard model. It's enormously complex. There are presentations online, and I'm sure that GNS will be happy to explain it to you if you have technical questions. The key thing to understand is that when MB look to incorporate this understanding of risk into the Building Act, there is a possibility of how earthquake-prone buildings are dealt with in a regulatory sense would change. The top line understanding of the model is essentially that the risk in Wellington and across all of eastern New Zealand from seismic activity is higher than as before. Probably the easiest way to understand it is to look at that little graph there. These are sites across the Wellington region. 1 means that there is no change, 2 means there is a doubling in risk. And as you can see, most sites face an increased risk under this model. When we look at what this looks like on the ground, if we look across the central city, this is what our earthquake-prone building stock looks like. Whilst they all appear as uniform red blotches, each one of those buildings has a particular story, a particular history, and a particular set of circumstances, which means that one does not always equal the other. Within that stock, there are heritage buildings, so those buildings that face regulatory restrictions that recognise their value. There are also earthquake-prone residential buildings. The residential buildings, because of their ownership structures and dynamics, face particular issues that other types of buildings don't necessarily face, and there is plenty of lived experience within this room that can speak to that more eloquently than I can. There is also your own buildings as councillors that you are ultimately responsible for, many of which have been covered by other officers so far, and you'll be coming back to with specialists later in the presentation. The takeaway I would give you is that we are first, we are not alone. Almost every region of New Zealand has a stock of earthquake-prone buildings. This is what central Auckland looks like if you map the earthquake-prone register onto that city. The main streets of towns like Thames look similar. So whilst we face this problem now, all of the provinces of New Zealand will face this problem in the future as these notices expire, and that is why whatever solutions that are come to ultimately need to be systemic, so that this problem isn't a national problem going forward.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, councillors. So, as the regulator, we have a unique role in discharging council's obligations under the Building Act in relation to earthquake-prone buildings. We are a creature of legislation across the business, and we are also, as it relates to this matter as well. We discharge our obligations using a methodology that's been developed by MBIE. We have 3 pretty coarse, blunt tools available to us for when buildings don't comply, and to comply with the Act and resolving the earthquake, it's any strengthening work where the building is, when it's earthquake prone, being under 34% of the NBS. The strengthening work needs to be done, or it can be demolished, and that's largely that's where the start and the stop of it lands. And if a building owner is non-compliant, we have 3 options available to us. That's a fine. We can take the building over at council's cost and fix it with a charge left on the land. But as I'll discuss later on, the scale of the problem ahead of us makes that an impractical option. And also we can take safety actions which largely look like closing a building.
Phil, can I just ask you to pull your mic close to you? Thank you.
Beg your pardon, I was talking past it. Apologies. So this is what the future looks like for us in very short order. By 2027, we have 300 buildings coming on stream. On stream means that their notices will have lapsed by the end of 2027. And in looking at that, we take note that the large part of the easy buildings have been addressed. These are the ones that have got complexities, and even if we had a compliant building owner market, we don't have a construction sector, we say, that can respond to that challenge. So that challenge is broken up in several dimensions. One that is of most interest to a number of people that we've been interacting with and who are here in the room with us are those that are living in apartment buildings, and also that are heritage buildings, which compounds it. And it's not just the buildings. It's important to remember that while we are talking about buildings, it's actually the occupants of those buildings, the tenants and the owners, and that has a social and economic impact that can sometimes be overlooked when we're just dealing with numbers. In discharging our obligations to the Act, we've got, broadly, we've got 5 tools available to us, or 5 approaches. We've recently set up a steering group that gives organisational visibility across the problem and then how we give effect to our obligations using a compliance guide that we've developed. Now, that compliance guide has got a number of principles that set out how we approach compliance with the Act and discharge our obligations under it. We've also got a prioritisation tool, a data-led prioritisation tool, the Resilient Buildings Model. While it's in development at the moment, it needs refinement, but once in production, we'll be able to use that to be able to better direct our efforts and attention around the city. There's an important scheme that's been set up with MB have led this. It provides an intensive case management service to building owners on a selection basis, and Ryan, who hasn't been introduced, Ryan is the manager of Resilient Buildings team. He's been working closely with MB in shaping what that looks like. And then, of course, we've got the council approach, our BAU. That's been developed, that approach, over a number of years of experience, including the URM program that followed the Kaikoura earthquake. I will just roll ahead. You may have seen this slide in the presentation that Liam circulated last night. To try and get a better idea of how we approach this problem, particularly as we go into this 300 buildings in 2027, what are the approaches available to us? Now, that blue line there represents the pure regulator. That's just pure enforcement. We have little to no engagement or interaction with building owners other than providing them with documents along the way, as we're legislatively obligated to, and then we engage heavily down the end there in that building owner journey when it becomes an enforcement matter. And based on our experience, we think that you might get about a 10% resolution of buildings through that approach. The red line there represents the current model. That's a light touch case management approach. We think we get about 20% resolution. That black line, the top line there, that's an intensive model that requires significant resource beyond which the council can afford. It's a very case management intensive approach. We think that we can get about 70% resolution there. Now, these numbers, those models rely on hypothesis, and we've got some very coarse modelling in the background, but we think of there or thereabouts direction, and if we progress those, it'll be independently verified and tested. Where this is heading, we get more of these. Now, that's to those that know it, I'm sure we all do know it, the old Tramways Hotel, 114 Adelaide Road. It is heritage. It's an EPB. It's been an earthquake-prone building for a long time. Essentially, this comes down to a question of affordability. The community, the owners, they can't afford to resolve, particularly buildings with these particular factors or dynamics. You'll see over there on the left a number of elements or factors come together to arrive at a position where it becomes intractable for the council, building owners, the community at large to resolve these types of buildings. And when you think about it on a building by building basis, you can probably come up with a way to address it, but when we're looking at it from a city scale, in particular these 300 buildings by end of 27, you do get a strong sense of the intractability of what we're dealing with. On that note, I'll hand across to Jason and Peter. not working, mate.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, councillors. So as Liam said at the start of this presentation, if we could take part 3 largely as read, I think with a number of papers that probably have come with over the last few weeks, few months, you understand the triggers for the basis for seismic assessments and really how we address those issues. What our slides largely address, though, is what is a seismic assessment, how are questions of whether a building is earthquake prone assessed and addressed, what the circumstances that council as a property owner would commission an assessment, and some of those scenarios are a regulator serving the notice, or substantial future investment which is planned, something like City Gallery, Michael Fowler Centre. Our slides also capture the key steps that we take as a property owner as part of a seismic assessment process, an overview of the occupancy risk assessment, which Peter was largely responsible for bringing into council, and this follows the MB guidelines issued in 2022. A summary, we've also put in there a summary of buildings observed as earthquake prone as a property owner, which include those in the PSR portfolio, but from property perspective, the majority are already covered in the Tanako presentation. I think that covers it, really. Peter, anything to add?
Yeah, there's the 2 final slides within the property set. I guess the two programs that council have currently looking at, which are looking at seismic assessment. So one is the Tanaka precinct generally. That by the time that program, I guess, comes to you, or options for that program come to you next year, seismic assessments would have been completed through the Tanaka precinct. The other area that we're looking at is the housing upgrade program. So effectively we're in a program business case mode at the moment, doing full assessment of the portfolio to understand what the risk profile is there before we come back to council with, I guess, a recommended option on how to deliver that program.
Good. All right. So, councillor, just bang on time, 25 minutes. I wanted to finish on the last, because I know there's going to be lots of questions, and as I said, and lessons indicated, take it as read. We circulated the slides last night. There's a lot more to them, and we will release it after this workshop, but we want to get straight to questions. I just wanted to touch quickly on the advocacy opportunities. So there is a position here that I believe the city could take, and I'm suggesting, along with Phil, some opportunities for us to discuss and explore. And starting with this wicked problem we have as a city manager, if you like, so putting aside our properties that we own and have our own earthquake-prone challenges with them, this wicked problem about the scale of the task, as Phil's indicated. So we know the market probably can't deliver the amount of work required to make these buildings safe by 2027. We know there are social and economic costs to our residents, and we know that in our role, both tasked with delivering and regulating these buildings, and our own buildings for that matter, so I've got my regulator hat on, I'll have to at some point also enforce a number of entities and agencies across the city that don't comply with the legislation. We believe this exercise that we're asked to do under the Act at the moment is actually almost insurmountable. And so as a regulator, we need to start advocating for change. And so what I've looked to present for a discussion today is this idea of a comprehensive review of the system, and the Minister's already indicated that's possible under the new government. We welcome that. The system review is and should be focused on striking the right balance. It should be looking at the needs of the occupants of these buildings, but also the social and economic impact on the city as these buildings are strengthened and made safe. It's also about this concept of proportionality. I think there's a space for us to discuss what our risk appetite is and how we manage other risks in our lives outside of earthquakes. We are always managing risks as a council and as a community, and we need to understand that as a city, but also I think nationally, and have that conversation. I think the cost of strengthening is something that needs to be addressed. We just don't believe, in our experience to date, in the current climate, that the sector, the industry, the construction sector has the bandwidth to deliver this peak we're having to see in 2027. And moving then to the opportunity for immediate relief, and I think that's an extension advocacy. This is about trying to get the government to extend this deadline by a further 3 years, helping potentially to facilitate this independent review, but also the options available to council that we've got to more deeply explore, and I think we have more work to do there, both Phil and the team acknowledge. We've got a good Kāinga order scheme at the moment. I think it could be made better. I think we could increase the amount available to the owners. That's currently capped at 250. I think that's worthy of discussion. I think the evaluation also of the insurance requirement under the scheme is probably needs to be looked at, and whether there is an opportunity to provide relief there. The pilot scheme, which Ryan deals with, it's had some success, to be fair. I don't think it's at a scale that we can say it's able to be applied to everyone, and I think we need to extend that and potentially encourage MB to broaden it. And finally, this is an opportunity for the city, the capital city of New Zealand, to lead. We've seen that graph about all the other provincial cities that are impacted, but also Christchurch and Auckland. I think we are close to government, and we have learnt and lived experiences both in our residents and our regulatory function. And I think we've got some really, really good insights we can work with central government on and trying to deal with this wicked problem. So I'll finish there, perhaps 5 minutes over, but we do have half an hour for questions. So the team here is here to answer them for you.
Kia ora, and thank you very much. The slides were very visual, so yeah, really good explanations there. Kia ora, sorry, I didn't quite get you all. Holden, did you have a question first online? Okay, kia ora, I'll go over to Councillor Pennant, then Councillor Brown, Free and McNulty.
Just 2 questions. First of all, thank you for your empathetic response to our residents, because, you know, that's my concern. My first question is the extension advocacy is something I've put in the media, thanks to Moana. Thank you. The first thing, though, is about giving confidence to owners that they will not be, I'm not blaming you, you're just doing your regulatory role, but the government will give some instruction to councils that regulatory action will not happen until the review has happened, because we've got owners who are literally looking at that at the moment, and I'm very, very concerned about anyone having to leave their office, their business or their home.
Well, absolutely part of, if council was of mind, part of our advocacy to government. I think I mentioned before this role that we have as a regulator. These are black and white rules. There is discretion in how we apply them, I suppose, in the sense of how Ryan and his team with Phil deal with case management, deal with the circumstances of the people, the body corporates, the residents and owners of these buildings have at that particular time. They all have different profiles. So whilst there is a black and white rule book under the Act that we're required to regulate, no situation is the same. We always deal with residents and the buildings on their merits. But the important thing that I talk about with the team, and Phil and I discuss often, is that there needs to be a sense of progress made. And there are building owners out there who aren't doing potentially what they could be doing. There are building owners out there who are trying their desperate to achieve the rating that they require to continue to live in the building. But there are other forces at play that prevent them from reaching.
Thanks. And my other question just is around whether staff have any reflection about the fact, and I'm not being political, it's just a straight question about money, that the MPSUD said we should upzone. Are Wellingtonians going to be able to afford the future costs of strengthening and ensuring their buildings once the quality of that building degrades over time according to the latest building standards? Kia ora.
I'll answer that, given I deal with the NPSUD the most. In many ways, then there's not a direct correlation between them. The NPSUD allows for greater density of buildings, but it doesn't specify as to their strength and quality. That's done under the Building Act. So in some cases, the additional property rights accorded under the NPSUD make strengthening schemes economic. However, it is clear that under the unit titles system, there is a problem with multi-unit buildings over time when it comes to the cumulative maintenance that can lead to earthquake problems. But I don't think we could pin that on the NPSUD.
No, all I mean is that there's a whole lot of upzoning with 6, 7-storey buildings. So these buildings will eventually become prone under the legislation. There's a lot of density planned. I'm not, of course, opposed to density. It's just the height where that does impose a lot of cost. And the insurance, what we're hearing from our constituents, is massive. Many, many thousands of dollars above what homeowners would pay just as on a single dwelling.
Looking at the current building stock of the city, not all buildings that were built in 1920 are earthquake prone or have been earthquake prone. Therefore, I'm not sure that we could say that any 7-storey buildings that were built today would become earthquake prone. So whilst I acknowledge that with density comes different risks, with density also comes different opportunities to address that risk.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Pennant. Councillor Brown.
Thanks. I've got a very, very peripheral understanding of this stuff, so my questions are probably a lot more simplistic than Iona's. I just wanted to follow up before I ask my questions, just on one of the questions that Iona asked. So, as I understand it, as you go up, I've been talking to building developers about, the 3-storey proposition, and for instance, in particular, Ian Castles with what he built in Willow Street. It clearly was a lot cheaper for him to build 3 stories than to go higher because of the earthquake cost. That was a very significant element of changing the economic cost of those marginal floors, which is why he didn't go further. Is that just an inevitable? And if we have rules which say you've got to build 6 stories and that's just not economic, do we end up with a kind of a conflict between our earthquake standards / the economics of building to those standards on the one hand, and then town planning rules that require certain levels of density on the others?
So when we have 6 stories under the district plan, it doesn't say that you have to build to 6 stories. That's the limit to which you can build. There are parts of the city where there is a minimum height limit that's generally set at about 2 stories. What you have effectively is as construction costs change through different economic dynamics, as you quite rightly have identified, there's a marginal cost. So, for example, you see quite a few 2-storey and 3-storey buildings. You don't see too many 5-storey buildings. You tend to see buildings are much taller than that, and that's that observed marginal cost you've identified. Where we've got to be careful with the coordination between planning rules and the dynamics of building safety and investment is setting rules in those medium densities where you can, say, set a minimum height limit of 3 stories and a maximum height limit of 4 stories, and at that point you create a essentially unbuildable situation in certain circumstances.
Gotcha. So I see. So there's nothing to stop another Paddington happening again. That's the best economic use of that site. The guy can do that again.
So the Paddington, as it stands, would fall foul of the minimum height rules. But what you would see is under those plans, you would probably see much taller buildings like the other taller apartment buildings around it occurring.
Okay. So my other question is this engineering, reviews that are being done of buildings, because I get, for me it's a complete black box, but I have had a number of conversations with specialist engineers who have looked at the original earthquake appraisals, and then they turn up and rework the whole equation and end up, going from 20% to 50%. And Nicola and I had a lunch a couple of weeks ago with a very experienced engineer who sort of talked about a number of those things. I mean, which does make it feel as if there's an enormously large amount of discretion about the engineering report outcomes. Is that correct, or is it just marketing spiel on his part?
So seismic assessments do rely upon professional judgment. So MB does have quite, I guess, prescriptive guidelines and by the way which engineers need to undertake seismic assessments. But engineers will inevitably look at buildings in different ways, and building a seismic assessment process is a bit of a reverse engineering exercise, whereby the assessments don't necessarily rely upon perfect information, i.e. that some assumed conditions of how those buildings were constructed need to be, I guess, assumed, and that's where I guess the professional judgment does come in. As a property owner, I guess the way that we tend to approach those situations about how do we make sure that an accurate or the most accurate result is returned on the performance of our building is we'll tend to choose engineers who have experience in designing structures of a comparable nature. And similarly, in the circumstance that we start to see some complexities in those assessments arise, we may bring in a peer reviewer as well to help maybe test some of the thinking and assumptions that underlie those assumptions. Also start to actually open up buildings and look at key structural interfaces and details to understand how they perform.
Thanks. Last question. I don't know what the Kaiga Ora scheme actually is, but could you just explain the insurance requirements? When you say removal of insurance requirements, what does that actually mean?
So currently there's a requirement that owners have insurance at the end of the process. So what we're asking is that requirement is removed because it's actually unachievable for a number of owners and a number of circumstances.
And I think that's because banks will only loan if they have a certain insurance threshold as well, and they'll only loan a certain amount to get to that strengthening level. So that's the problems that some owners accessing that scheme are finding, is that they're never going to get the insurance because they haven't got it to a strong. They haven't got to a level of strength that the banks will allow to loan, I think, in their modelling, as one of the examples.
Thank you. Councillor Free?
Yeah, look, I'm really sorry, maybe it's just something I've forgotten, but can you remind me of this 250,000? What actually is it, and what's, yeah?
So it's a loan scheme established by MB and run by Kāinga Ora, and it loans money to owners as a loaner of last resort, essentially.
Any owner?
Any apartment, earthquake-prone apartment owner.
Okay. All right. Do they have to pay it back? It's a loan, and what's the sort of basic arrangements for that?
Not knowing the full details of it, there essentially is a loan repayment scheme. It comes due at either sale of the apartment or, unfortunately, death of the person who is occupying the apartment, and there is interest charged on the loan throughout its life.
So when you say explore changes, we'd be advocating to government to look at something. It's not that we would be. Okay, that's I think where I got a bit confused. Thank you.
Councillor McNulty?
Let's jump into the heritage part of this, bugbear in my life. So from my understanding, we have property owners that they cannot physically demolish their buildings because they've got a heritage status on it, and they also cannot raise finance because you're talking $500,000 to $1 million per unit owner to do the strengthening. Is that the case in some buildings in the city?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So there's what I saw missing in this advocacy opportunity. We need to talk about heritage in the earthquake context, obviously, as well. And like Gordon Wilson's just another perfect example of that. So I'd ask if we can think about how when heritage and earthquake strengthening come together, because obviously those owners are stuck. Can we do anything about that in a district plan?
Do you mean systemically or specifically?
Both. But let's talk individually, specifically for now, because we know there's identifiable units where this is a problem.
Yes. So essentially, As you make decisions on the district plan, you have the opportunity to bring amendments under matters under which you have scope that has descended to you from the commissioners. I'll turn that into English early next year for you. The second opportunity is you can order a plan change. The difficulty with doing that is the Resource Management Act and the Pōhere Whenua Act that are designed to recognise the significance of heritage, and it works essentially as a form of one-way valve. Once something has that significance recognised, it's very hard to pull it back through again. So you may need to also ask for additional powers and changes to legislation depending on the scope of what you want to do.
Section 6 of the RMA. Sorry, Section 6 is a matter of national importance on heritage and it would have to be changed. And as you know, the Nats are rescinding the changes to the RMA.
So I guess my question would be, can we do a plan change, or can we take through to DP and actually individually call out every single earthquake-prone lots, because that's going to go to the Environment Minister in terms of how we actually get this problem solved for Wellington? I know that's a bit of not the intention of the process, but this is such a pressing problem, it seems like one way to get it in front of the government.
So we'll be discussing with each of you what your intentions are around the district plan and how you wish to shape amendments. That's probably a conversation for then.
Yeah, I think, Councillor, that was at the district plan briefing. I think last week you were there for that, I think. Yeah. I mean, so the advice is if that scale of amendment was to be supported by councillors, that we would have a heads up of that and sit down and provide you with some advice about how you construct it. Because it will have trappings, and of course, in certain circumstances, the Minister has final sign-off on these matters.
Yeah. And last one, if we're looking at advocacy options, why not just talk to Auckland Council and Christchurch, because the three of us are more than 50% of the market. So if we just can work as a small group and say this is the change we need, rather than trying to go through LGNZ or 70-something councils, is that possibly the way of advocating?
That's something that we've discussed, and it's good that you're raising it. So that's at an ELT level and at a team level, that's just started those conversations actually. So reaching out to find out some of the evidence you saw before today that Sean got from Auckland was a kind of an opportunity to talk to them about how they're going about dealing with the issue.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, this is unfortunately a complex problem that we need to understand. I was wondering if, as part of moving forward, we could get a better explanation of what seismic risk really means. I'm reassured that if a building is not 100%, it doesn't mean it's unsafe necessarily in any significant way. And I really think that when you have these measures, like it needs to be up to 36% or up to 50%, that we need a lot more information or examples to say what does that really mean for the people living in there or the people who might want to buy such a building, because I still get very confused and concerned that it's not 100%. Everyone wants 100%, but I get the sense when in the seismic world it's a bit of the gold star thing. It's the 5-star hotel is 100% as opposed to the fact that we can live in it, and if it's only 3 stars, that's fine.
Who wants to have a go at answering that? I think Moana is quite good in this space too, but let's go to Sean first.
Thanks. So in terms of seismic risk, I think the easiest way to think of it is you have the seismic risk that is essentially from an earthquake to the city, so tectonic science. Then you have seismic risk as understood through the building regulations, which is where your percentages are coming from. With that understanding, one of the things you've identified is essentially an NBS is in some ways a relatively coarse tool for explaining a complex situation. How we explain the composition of an NBS is probably more for the people on my right. We've reached the frontier of my ability to explain.
I guess to describe it simply, NBS stands for New Building Standard. So if you were to design a building, a 33% building represents 33% the strength of what a new building would be built to. In a seismic event, all buildings will behave differently. So, the Kaikoura earthquake was a great example of that, whereby you saw some taller buildings perform quite differently to some of the shorter buildings. So it relies on the resonance of, or the period of the earthquake, the resonance of the building, and a whole bunch of other things. Beyond that, and that's one question about will a building exceed its design strength? It's probably the best way of describing it. Where a building does exceed its design strength, they may fail in a variety of different ways, and that's how the building is actually constructed. So the term that's often used is the mode of failure. So, so an MBS rating, I think it is, to Sean's point, it's a coarse measure, but doesn't necessarily represent the risk of, harm to people in the event that are designed.
Yeah, you guys are just reinforcing the need that we need better explanations. No offence.
Untaken.
But something that's more pre-cooked would be very helpful.
Understood.
So if I could, I think that's why, well, I don't think, I know, that's why we've asked for a review to see whether this is fit for purpose, because to the point, there are lots of things that are going to happen in an earthquake that are going to affect the outcome for any particular building. The NBS is one tool that we have. To the point, you have new building standard. As the standards get higher, then the existing buildings fall down as a matter of percentage, despite the fact that nothing's changed. So what we're saying is, can we have a conversation with government and MB about how we deal with risk? Because we don't treat other risks in the same way. And probably part of the reason for that is a natural human reaction to mass casualties that you see after events like Christchurch. Cars kill a lot of people, but we don't require people to keep updating their cars as the standards for cars get better. You don't have to take the car that's already there and make it. So what we're saying is we're treating risk here very differently. Now, that might be appropriate, but let's have a conversation about whether, in fact, it's driving outcomes that, number one, aren't necessarily going to achieve the benefits that the legislation is trying to achieve, and is basically presenting a lot of social and economic harm to the city and to residents and building owners. So it's a conversation about risk and whether we've got that right.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Moana. A second question is, I guess it's sort of related. You're sort of saying that maybe
Third question, Councillor Randall.
Question, which is explain seismic risk.
Okay, keeping a tab.
I've only had one question though. So my second question is, in terms of what you're saying, just to confirm really, is maybe comparing older buildings to new buildings for seismic risk is not necessarily the most appropriate approach to get an outcome that's actually achievable.
Yes. Essentially, one of the questions in your advocacy is a relative standard the best way to deal with this, or should there be a move to an absolute standard, and is that possible?
Okay, and my last question is just following up with Councillor Pennant. The high standards for building new buildings is driving up costs, and we have a spatial plan that's sort of based around population going in at certain densities across different parts of the city, yet it doesn't seem economic to build the buildings into which they're going to go. So is that review also going to feed back perhaps into the spatial plan in terms of where the city's population's growth is going to go, given that we've got this sort of catch-22?
So you have to remember that the spatial plan is due to take place over many, many years, 30 years from memory, and that dynamics will change over that time. We've already seen it with interest rates. They're almost double from when that was passed. But the land zoning is not a magical spell or a jelly mould into which you just pour the city to take shape. What it represents is the outer limits of a shape. So if it becomes clear when the spatial plan is next reviewed that the city cannot take that shape, then that is time as governors for you to determine what the new feasible shape is.
And apologies, Councillor Randall, I did lose track of the first question. I'll put myself on the list, and we'll round up unless Councillor Pennant, you have any other questions that you'd like to ask on behalf of the community that are in the room. I'll just give you two questions from me. I cycle past tramways every morning and evening. And question, what is the status? What is a way we can help the public understand the status of those buildings and where they're at? Especially if there are going to be more of them.
So as it relates to the Tramways building, or as
I guess just as a, it's a question I would like to ask every day. How is this progressing? And I'm sure I'm not the only one. Is there a public way, a way that the public...
Yeah, so the public can access the MB earthquake prone building register. And so that's public information. You can find out the status of individual buildings. There's no public mechanism at the moment to do it en masse, although there are some course search tools that does help you with that. But so that is the place for the public to go to.
Okay, thank you. Do we have a page on our website with any kind of way to direct?
Yes.
We do? Great, good, thank you. The next question is around process, and so I just asked the CEO, how do we officiate the blessing from council to go ahead and advocate for this?
Okay, thank you, Chair. So you've heard a presentation from the team, which at first describes how the assessed seismic resilience of our city has substantially increased. And we've focused particularly then on the matter of above ground structures, current legislation or regulation, the way in which buildings are assessed, the role we have as a regulator, but then what this means for the economic and social well-being of not only our city but cities throughout New Zealand. And so I think there is a very important advocacy role for the City Council, working alongside other cities such as Auckland, to raise suggestions, helpful and constructive suggestions, and liaise with central government. And the question really is, how do we realise the mandate from you to undertake that advocacy? I think a first step may be a discussion with the Mayor, because I think this issue can also be linked to an even higher level issue for the city around seismic resilience. And that is, there is an apparent increase in damage to both to underground infrastructure that has accelerated significantly since the Kaikoura earthquake. There is a case that the city can make that there has been a major impact which is badly affecting our ability to pay as a city. There's also a significant and much broader discussion to be had about insurance. Insurance and the impact of the new seismic resilience assessment for the city is significant for the council, but also for private building owners in the city. So I think it would make sense to develop a clear strategy, a number of proposals that may actually link to a future city or regional deal. But I think the issue of the regulatory requirements on building owners today is a national issue, and one that we should see as linked to but separate from a city deal. So the question is, step one, a discussion with the Mayor about an advocacy strategy, and whether it would be a powerful thing to then bring that back to the Council in the new year for a public debate and resolution. And that's a question I would take advice from the Mayor on.
Great answer, thank you. Councillor Pennant, we have 5 minutes with a lot of
Really
intelligence
quickly,
in the
yes.
room, so I'll hand it over to you.
And I've talked to the Mayor about that strategy, and it's already started being drafted, so we'll get something sorted. Liam, we just had a briefing where we were told an old building that was strengthened in 2014 might have to be done again. Will you include this in your advocacy work and thinking? This is the City Gallery. This is ridiculous. It should not need to be done so quickly.
I think the question's to me as a regulator, but as a property owner, I'm sure the city would be interested in bundling it up.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it goes to the point about absolute versus relative standards that we were talking about before.
at the time the legislation was passed, this issue was canvassed because we didn't want this to be an endless merry-go-round. The other question I had was what actually does resolution mean? At 70%, that would be a good outcome, but if that means forced sales and people then can't afford to get into another home, then that's a failure. So can you just outline what that means?
So resolution is as per the Act with the MB methodology. It is the building is strengthened or demolished. It's as simple as that.
If you look at the interventions that we can take on one of those slides, yeah. Okay, so that's very problematic because that wouldn't be what I would see as a good resolution.
Anything else, Councillor Pennant? Well, I think we can call that a wrap, but perhaps officers, I would ask if you wouldn't mind just hanging around for a couple of minutes and